I am now called to order the Society's 2477th meeting and the 92nd Annual Joseph Henry Lecture, in what is now the 152nd year since its founding on March 13, 1871. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Larry Milstein. I am the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our members, guests, and friends, including everyone here in the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club, and everyone tuning in on YouTube for tonight's lectures on architectures for the new space age. Let's first thank some sponsors. PSW is grateful to PSW full-year series sponsors, PSW member Mike Helton and Helton Associates, and the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University. We're also grateful to the PSW Spring Lecture Series sponsor, PSW member Tim Thomas, for his generous support. And we are grateful to the sponsor of tonight's lecture, UC San Diego, a world-leading education and research institution where students gain a world-class education and boundary-breaking visionaries create unconventional solutions and the next generation of cures, all with, I can attest to this personally, a spectacular ocean backdrop. And I have swum on those beaches. If you haven't, go. Thank you to all of them. Speaking of sponsors, I mentioned at the last meeting and the meeting before, the Society has begun a fundraising campaign. We actually are in the middle of it, towards the end of it, to ensure that we'll be able to meet expenses in the coming year, especially the much higher prices for facilities we use at the Cosmos Club. I'm pleased to report that we pretty much reached our goal for this fiscal year, primarily due to full-year series and individual lecture sponsorships. We're looking ahead to next year, and we hope the Society will have the same level of support for the coming fiscal year when we expect, due to inflation and gouging, costs will again increase. And if you care about PSW and you want to continue to grow, and please contribute financially as much as you can. And even if you can't, let us know of any individuals or organizations who might be interested to support the Society. I can be reached most easily by email at president@pswscience.org. I'm pleased to announce the following new members. James Bradford, cybersecurity engineer with Lockheed Martin, interested in cryptology, physics, and dark matter, learned at PSW through Meetup. Denise Busan, biochemist, retired from NIH, interested in biochemistry, genetics, medicine, geology, and astronomy, who is a returning member. And tonight's speakers who learned at PSW from the invitation to speak here tonight and whose interests will be clear in part from tonight's lectures. Paul Kessler, Ellie Morgan, and Corky Clinton. There's also Daniel Inocente, but he's already a member by virtue of having given the lecture on at the 2412th meeting of the Society on September 20, 2019. Now, if you're not a member, join now. And then you will enjoy all of the great benefits of being a PSW member, primarily that you help us bring science to everybody. All members are entitled to wear the PSW Science Rosette. It's not an arbitrary design. As some of you may know, the symbol for induction is a coil, and the stripes on the PSW Rosette are emblematic of the coil, and this is because the founder of PSW and its first president, Joseph Henry, is known for his work on fundamental aspects of induction. Now, all members receive a signed copy of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin. If you're a new member and you haven't gotten yours, please see me after the lectures. There's an exception for Daniel because he's already gotten one. So he is going to get a copy of Volume 10, which is an interesting volume. It contains, in addition to the general meeting minutes, a list of all the members at the time, an extensive obituary and biography of Spencer Fullerton Baird, who founded the National Museum of Natural History and provided many of the collections that it had as its initiation. And it also has an index of all volumes and publications of PSW proceeding up to 1887. So you're a lucky guy. Member at large, Connor Nixon, will now read the minutes prepared by Recording Secretary Camille Lance of the 2,476th meeting and the lecture by Amanda Podani on Ancient Lives Preserved in Cuneiform, Impressions of Mesopotamian Society over 3,500 years ago. Connor?
On April the 28th, 2023, from the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., and by Zoom webinar broadcast on the PSW Science YouTube channel, President Larry Milstein called the 2,476th meeting of the Society to order at 8:03 p.m. Eastern Time. He welcomed new members, and the recording secretary read the minutes of the previous meeting. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Amanda Podani, History Professor Emeritus at the Cal Poly Pomona. Her lecture was entitled Ancient Lives Preserved in Cuneiform. Podani focused on the Mesopotamian people who lived over 3,500 years ago. Despite the significant time gap, tablets inscribed in cuneiform script provide abundant information about both communities and individuals, including non-powerful figures. Podani highlighted the wealth of knowledge obtained from surviving Mesopotamian documents, particularly clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. The speaker acknowledged the challenge of unevenly spread information throughout Mesopotamian history. The tablets offer insights into various aspects of ancient life, and while millions more remain undiscovered, the speaker focused on analyzing a specific tablet within the broader historical context. Podani went on to discuss the discovery and analysis of several cuneiform tablets that provide evidence about the ancient city of Turka and the kingdom of Hana. These tablets share common features and suggest a connection, she explained, between the rulers of Hana and King Hammurabi of Babylon. The analysis of these tablets provides insights into the historical timeline and the development of writing during the Old Babylonian period. She then related her own experience working on an archaeological excavation at the site of Turka in Syria in 1983. She mentioned that Turka was possibly the capital of the ancient kingdom of Hana, which extended north along the Khabur River. The excavation team faced challenges due to the modern town of Ashara, which is built on top of the ancient city, limiting their excavation areas. The speaker's main interest was in the social significance of the cuneiform tablets found at the site. The speaker discussed her research on the tablets recovered from the ancient kingdom of Hana. The focus of her analysis was to determine the sequence in which the tablets were written, especially those with royal seals. Her research primarily revolved around figuring out the chronology of the kings of Hana. She analyzed various characteristics of the tablets, including personal names and determinatives, and observed differences between earlier and later writings. Podani further pondered the distribution of cuneiform archives and libraries over time, with certain periods and places being more represented than others. She emphasized the evolving understanding of Hana's history based on the analysis of the tablets and the importance of archaeological discoveries in shaping historical knowledge. One site, Rushdogan, stood out with more than 10,000 tablets found within a 68-year period. The speaker emphasized the disproportionate distribution of the tablets, highlighting an opportunity to study micro-histories. She mentioned her own book, Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, A New History from the Ancient Near East, which explores the lives of individuals from various professions and time periods, including a microhistory of a man named Pagaram. Next, the question-answer period began. A lifetime member of PSW asked, "What grew in the fields, and who conquered Babylon in the Dark Ages?" The speaker responded that the fields were largely used to grow barley, but some fields also grew wheat, onions, leeks, garlic, and generally green vegetables and even sweets such as dates. She continued to explain that many people are blamed for the conquering of Babylon and discussed some of the primary considerations. An online viewer asked whether the letters from the 1300s BC in Egypt could tell us anything about Hannah. The speaker said that unfortunately the treasure trove of letters between ancient kings is not valuable for learning about the kingdom of Hannah, which is not referred to in any of the literature at the time. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker and made the usual housekeeping announcements and invited guests to join the society. President Milstein adjourned the meeting at 10:02 p.m. Eastern Time. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 16 degrees Celsius. Weather, cloudy. Attendance in the Powell Auditorium, 60. And on the YouTube live stream, 37, for a total live attendance of 97. Views in the 2 weeks after the lecture were 698. Respectfully submitted, Connor Nixon, on behalf of Recording Secretary Camille Lance.
Thank you, Connor. Are there any comments on the minutes, any additions or corrections to them? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion from a member to accept the minutes as read. Okay. Second by any member? All members in favor? All members opposed? Minutes are unanimously accepted and will be posted to the website in due course. Please note that the opinions expressed in these lectures are those of the speakers and are not the official opinions of NASA or Lockheed or any other organizations that may be seen to be somehow associated with the speakers. All questions will be fielded after the lecture during an all-hands Q&A session with all the speakers here on the stage. Paul, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, PSW members and guests, for inviting me today to talk about human exploration of space. I'm really excited about it. Today, I'm excited to explain to you, first, what the vision of NASA is in the exploration of space by humans. And in doing so, talk about the actual overall strategy that NASA has in order to accomplish this, to pave the way to this human exploration. Secondly, I also want to talk about the habitation considerations and challenges that we're facing in order to have long-term habitation in space. And then finally, also to wrap this all up with the idea that collaboration is the key to our success. So why do we go? This is the first question that we need to ask ourselves. Now, there's a myriad of answers that can come to this. The agency provides us some of these answers in the form of the 3 pillars that we use. These are 3 principles by which we operate in the design of our architectures. And this starts with, first and foremost, the science. Gathering the science to understand the formation of the planets, the formation of the solar system, our own place within the universe itself. We are a scientific organization after all, so it makes sense that we would be looking at science. Secondarily is our national posture, the ability for us to provide leadership, a new economy in space that maybe transcends anything that we have dealt with before. This is a new regime. This is a new area of industry, and there's a lot of potential here. And finally, inspiration. What is the point of surviving as a human being? You want to thrive. You want to not only survive, you want to thrive and flourish. And so flourishing and thriving really requires the inspiration that comes from this audacious goal of human exploration of space. So in the realm of changing administrations and in the realm of changing budgetary constraints, there's a challenge that we all face, especially within the agency. And the way that we have made as a strategy to meet this challenge is to perform this function of architecting from the right and executing from the left. And what we've done is we've provided a Moon to Mars objectives that the agency has set out to tell us what that end goal would look like. Because it's important to understand your needs, goals, and objectives. And that feeds into the architecture teams that work both in the lunar architecture as well as the Mars architecture itself into how do we design these systems. We decompose these objectives into their characteristics and needs and their use cases and functions. And by breaking them down into that, we're able to understand what the architecture does, how it performs, the gaps in technology and development that we need to fill in order to actually perform this exploration. But NASA doesn't do things in a vacuum. And so it reaches out to the community as a whole to try to get some inputs into these objectives. And it did this in 2022, if you might recall, if you saw the Moon to Mars objectives, and got information back both from NASA as well as commercial and international partners. It's important that when we develop these objectives and these goals, that we know that these are the right ones for us. There was, actually after this time, there was the reiteration of some of these objectives to formulate them a little bit better. And it was helpful to have that input from the community. So when we architect from the right and we go to the left, we recognize that in that process of developing architectures, we needed to communicate again to the overall community to help our industrial partners as well as our international partners the insights that they need in order to develop the technologies and systems and capabilities that we need in order to accomplish these goals. And so we've developed in this regime, we've developed the architecture definition document, a detailed document about how this architecture is supposed to work and how the implementation of the strategy is supposed to work. Again, we've also provided the Moon to Mars architecture summary, which gives us these strategies and objectives. And then finally, white papers to show why is it important that we're doing the things that we're doing. Well, when we architect from the right, we then need to execute from the left. And we do that starting with getting the first humans on the moon. If we're going to get to Mars, we want to use Moon as the springboard for doing that. And it's been a long time, quite frankly, too long for many of us, that humans have been on the moon since the Apollo days. Now we're finally doing that again. And we don't want to stop there. It's not the end point. If we ended up there, we would end up really back at Apollo. But we don't want to end there. We want to have foundational exploration. We want to build up these capabilities so that there's long-term sustainment of survival of humans and, I argue, thriving of humans in the sense that they can do exploration of the lunar surface. And that's what we're looking to do. Then we can move on to sustained lunar evolution. This is where we evolve into long-term sustainment, living on the moon, industrial base, the capability to do that. And then finally, and most importantly, humans on Mars. A very audacious challenge at that, many, many miles away. Now in 2022, we had this architecture concept reviews that we have done every time we do a strategic analysis cycle. This is our analysis of the architecture itself to determine those capabilities, the gaps, and the performance of the architecture. These analysis concepts reviews are what we use to report back to our leadership about what those gaps are, and then to help feed that in an iterative process to then fill those gaps. Now in 2022, we've done this related to the human lunar return, and the reason for that is because that's the first thing that we need to do, get humans back on the moon. But then in 2023, our plan is to now focus on the other endpoint. Remember, architecting from the right. And so we need to do that by considering Mars. What do I need to do on all the previous segments of this architecture in order to feed back into Mars? So I start at the end point. And that's what we're doing in 2023. Now, habitation itself is one of the major challenges that we're dealing with. And in habitation, we have different platforms in order for us to understand those gaps and capabilities. It's not enough in terms of getting knowledge about things. This inspiration that we have is to gain knowledge about the world that we have, but it's not just knowledge. It's experience. It's experience. It's being able to stand on the foot, on the moon itself. It's to be able to do that small step for one person, but then for all of humanity. And so it's important that we have that experience. Experience leads to wisdom, right? So in that vein, we have to get experience also in space. One of those biggest things that we have is the opportunity of ISS. The International Space Station is a treasure trove of information. It helps lead us to those advancements in technology that help all of us, but also to prepare us for future missions into the outer solar system. Then we also have commercial LEO destinations, which will pick up from where ISS left off. But we also have to consider our ground tests. We have analogs. We have CHAPEA, which is an organization that's running a ground analog for a long period of time. I think it's a couple of years. And they're going to understand what humans really need, what the architecture really needs, what human systems need to be, and how humans are going to survive long-term in space or on another planetary body. And that's important. Well, and then we're also developing other technologies that are going to be in cislunar space, around the moon. And we have this gateway program that we're working on to develop habitation in cislunar space around the moon. And then we also have the development of the Mars Transit Habitat. We have to have the ability to shake down and define our systems properly before we send a giant habitat all the way to Mars, especially for 2 million miles that you have to do. But then we also have the lunar surface itself. This partial gravity environment, the dust, the swings in terms of temperatures from negative 270 to 280 Fahrenheit, major swings. We need to understand how to live there. It's a complicated process. And then also into Mars itself, being able to do the science that we need to do, being able to accomplish it in the other regimes and the other segments that we have. So, there are some habitation challenges that we need to undergo. When we're thinking about the surface, we need to think about things like delivery mass. Mass is still king. That's the word. Mass is still king. It is mass that we have to get down. The weight of that vehicle, we have to get down to the surface. Now, we've heard some announcements about certain mass limits that we have in getting to the surface. As those get larger, we're excited to have that opportunity. It allows us more opportunity to have long duration living. But mass is still a challenge. Physics doesn't lie. Or at least it doesn't lie well. Then we have to think about functional volumes. People don't want to live in a tiny box. If you remember the Apollo days, they did have to stay in a tiny box. But we don't want to do that. Remember, we go from survival, but we want to be in thriving, all right? And we want to thrive in space. And it's necessary that we get those functional volumes. And we are trying to meet that challenge through some technologies that we're already developing with our partners. Outfitting. Being able to put systems into these habitats, making sure that you have the necessary exercise, the medical, the crew facilities, a bathroom, maybe a functioning toilet, because everybody likes a functioning toilet, right? Dust contamination. If you remember Gene Cern and how full of dust he was when he was sitting inside the Apollo module, you could just see a person that had just been worn out from EVA and just full of dust. That dust may not be as big of a problem on the moon, but it certainly will become a more serious problem on Mars with the different chemistry that Mars has within its soil. So we need to monitor that, not just from the human aspect, but also from the habitation aspect. You could understand that if you start getting dust into all your computers and systems, that could cause a real problem. So we need to know how to deal with that. Radiation protection. We're very lucky to be here on Earth, protected from the enormous amounts of radiation that are happening in space. From solar particle events to galactic cosmic radiation, heavy elements from exploding stars, or even energy coming from our own star, the sun. But we have to protect the human body as well. We could have short-term as well as long-term implications on the human body, and we need to find ways to actually mitigate this as much as possible, especially when we get outside of that magnetic field that surrounds us and protects us every day. We can understand this is going to become more of a serious problem out in outer space. Dormancy. This is an issue that many people don't really think about, but if we're going to send some vehicle into space, and we're going to leave it there without a human on board, we have to still make sure it works when we come back. We don't want to show up at our house and everything is broken and we have to fix everything. So finding ways to do this, potentially through autonomy and robotics, but some way to keep our system still functioning when we do come back. Until we can establish long-term presence, this is going to continue to be an issue. Now, surviving the night requires some thermal and power considerations. Power is a really big and serious challenge on the moon. Now, it may not seem that way, but when you have to have an enormous amount of power, if you've ever looked at your power bill, and you think about the enormous amount of power that needs to power all these vehicles to provide the entire living space for you, you have to solve that somehow. But you also have to consider the fact that it's going to get pretty hot outside, and it's also going to get pretty cold outside. And you need to be able to provide the power that's necessary, as well as the energy storage that's necessary, to continue to keep your systems functioning, because they're not going to be able to handle freezing temperatures or extraordinarily hot temperatures without being able to control that. And logistics, delivery, and loading. If you want to go somewhere, it's important that you have something to eat, something to drink, and in fact, all the way down to having the air to breathe. And we need to consider that because mass still dominates the equation. And then finally, the capability to maintain and repair systems itself. We know things will break. They break all the time. I'm always fixing stuff at home. I wish I would stop fixing things at home. But it's constant, right? And so we need to have a way of doing that without having to try to see if there are Lowe's somewhere on the moon that I can go to, or maybe a Home Depot. And I'm not endorsing either one of those, by the way. Okay. All right. So when we go from the surface and now we need to go to Mars, it might seem like a small leap, but it's an enormous leap. There's a lot of challenges that we face in going to Mars. We do not have spares resupply. So when I talked about that maintenance component, I don't have the things that I need to fix just coming to me on a constant basis. I have to bring everything with me. And that is going to also impact the propulsion systems that have to take me. And every time I add a kilogram of mass, that propulsion system has to have a bunch more propellant to push it. And so it's going to start eating my lunch. Excuse the phrase, it's not going to really eat a lunch. And then we have waste and trash management. We have to be able to get rid of our trash, we have to get rid of our waste, we have to manage it. We do not want to take that everywhere with us. And also this feeds back to our propulsion systems. We want to get rid of things that we don't need anymore so we don't have to push it around the solar system. And then we have to have the capability of storing all those things, which is obvious. Now, in terms of human and health and performance, a lot of you have probably seen, if you've researched anything about long-term habitation in space, these ideas of rotating cylinders and whatnot. Well, there's gravity, there's radiation, there's things that will affect the human body. You don't want to get to the surface of Mars and not be able to walk, not be able to do anything. So we have to find ways of taking care of individual human beings. We are working on that, and we will continue to work on that. Now, in terms of the habitat itself, we want to make sure that a habitat is prepared for a long-duration mission that requires a long-duration shakedown. We have to test out all those systems. We don't want to go to Mars and find out nothing works, or nothing's the right thing for us, or it creates problems for human beings that have to actually live on board. And then again, back to the radiation protection, but also micrometeoroid and orbital debris. We don't want anything bursting the bubble, so to speak. We don't want to lose oxygen and atmosphere to space. And then communication delays. These are extraordinarily high. I think you've probably seen this when you maybe watch movies like, popular movies like The Martian, where it's multiple minutes to and from the planet to Earth. We can imagine that's going to create some problems. It's going to create problems in terms of astronauts being able to be trained to repair items, to maintain things. And whenever anything goes bad, you're kind of on your own. So we have to find ways of handling that. And that leads me right down to the ability to cover for major faults, for major problems. We want to continue living. We don't want to just survive. We want to thrive. Now, as a part of all of that logistics that we need. We need to feed ourselves, right? We need to have drinking water, we need to have oxygen, we need to have clothing. There are so many things that the human body needs, and these things start to add up. So one of the ways that we have sought to try to solve this is to try to use different closure levels of environmental control and life support systems. Now, there's the open loop system that just takes your stored gases, your stored water, and it provides it to the humans in space. But there's another option, and that is reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. We want to do that as much as possible, especially the further we get from Earth. So you can regenerate water and fluids, and you could also produce oxygen from water. So we have these opportunities that are open to us. And what we've found is that if you're able to close that loop within only a few missions of 30-day missions on the surface of the moon, you've already bought back the entire mass that you needed to send in the first place if you didn't have that. Now, in terms of space, we have different classes of habitation. We have our class 1, which is the pre-integrated habitat, the things that we're familiar with, like ISS. But in class 2, we have this ability now to have prefabricated habitats that actually expand. You might say inflate, as inflatable soft goods. But then you've got to deal with the outfitting portion of that. And then you have class 3, which I think Corky is going to spend some time talking a little bit about, and that is that in situ development of habitats themselves. Now, I'm only going to touch on class 2 because we're doing a lot of investment at NASA into these inflatable soft goods. They provide us a lot of volume that a launch vehicle fairing prevents us from having normally. It's the volume that we need. It's the space that we need. Now, we have these different layers within the fabric to hold this thing together. But one thing I do want to make a note of is that inflatable habitats are not like latex balloons. They're extremely tough. And it only takes about 0.5 psi of pressure to make them extremely tough. So I've heard things like 10 times as strong as steel. So these things are not soft, right? Even though we call them soft goods, it's almost a misnomer. But we do have a capability here that we didn't have in the past that we continue to develop. Now, these soft goods are not new technologies. They've been developed even in the 60s and 70s and all the way up to today. But our contract partners like Lockheed Martin and others are actually expanding that technology development. They're actually growing that. And so we're excited to see where this ends up. Now, you can see the soft goods here and how they deploy in the different configurations that we have. You can see on the bottom, you can see this surface habitat, its expansion from this small shriveled up thing. Now, this is a radial expansion of a habitat itself, but you could have expansion in all directions. Inside of these habitats, there is a metallic core, and that core structure holds a lot of the systems that we have, because we need to be able to have those systems anyway. This is an advantage of doing that. As long as I can fit inside the fairing, I can do this whole radial expansion. And we've done a lot of testing with this, working with Lockheed Martin, working with Aerospace, working with our contract partners. We've done different things that fit within the NASA guidelines where they call for burst testing, where we actually expand these things until they explode to a high pressure. And then our subscale creep tests, where we do a long-term deformation testing on the actual structures to see how they function over a longer period of time. Now, we've supported these with our commercial partners because we do feel that these are important technologies as we go into the future, because we know that volume and space, and I mean, anytime you want to buy a house, I know you want to look at the floor plan and see how much space you got. And this is no different than in space. Although I'm using space too many times here. Okay. And so we're working with our next tech partners in Appendix A in habitation systems. We've been doing this for a number of years. We continue to do this, and we will continue to do this. So the point is that we want to go from our terrestrial home here on Earth We want to be able to move into a low Earth orbit, which we've already done. We want to expand that capability so that we can get all the way through cislunar space, the lunar surface, and out to Mars. And it's going to require a lot of challenges. It's going to require a lot of technology development, and it's going to require a lot of partnerships. The collaboration that we have with our international partners and with commercial industry is key. And I hope that my lecture has really emphasized that point. They are doing a lot of this partnership from their own money, from their own resources. And this is both from the international partner side as well as the commercial side. And we're trying to fund that, and we're trying to move it forward. So, in the end, I hope this lecture was informative for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have questions, I will be happy to answer any of them at the question and answer period. So, thank you for your time and attention.
All right. Well, once again, thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks for having us up here. We all love talking about this topic the most. We're very passionate about it, all of us here. So tonight I want to talk with you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at Lockheed Martin, but also to get us to the moon and Mars, and what we're doing in low Earth orbit as well. And then also just touch on some of the challenges similar to what Paul just talked to you all about. So it was a wonderful foundation of information for you all. So I'll touch on some of that, some additional challenges that when we look to going to Mars, what that looks like, and what we're doing here on Earth right now to prepare for that. So at Lockheed Martin, we are doing a lot of technology development here that is really going to lay the foundation for us getting to Mars. Just like Paul said, we can't just focus on any one place. Everything we're developing now feeds forward to technology that is needed from low Earth orbit to be tested on the moon, and tested on the moon because it's going to be implemented on Mars. So we truly are looking at the long-term goal of helping to bring humans to the red planet, and then thinking backwards about what needs to happen on what timeline, what technologies need to be developed, because a lot of these technologies, there's a very long development timeline for these. So if we don't start now or yesterday, we're going to continue to push out the timeline to get to Mars. So let's just talk first about some of the key things in low Earth orbit that are going to help us, transportation and get to the moon and then on to Mars. So many of you may be familiar with some of the low Earth orbit crew transportation vehicles that are out there today. We have the Russian Soyuz vehicle, we have the SpaceX Crew Dragon, and then also the Boeing Starliner. So these are the three primary crew transportation vehicles bringing us from Earth up to low Earth orbit, right now to the International Space Station. But then hopefully, over the coming years, we are going to be having some commercial space stations will be getting developed. NASA has a program called the Commercial LEO Destinations Program. And right now there are several teams, there's 3 teams involved with that are all have different concepts for low Earth orbit stations that will eventually take the place of the International Space Station. And then a 4th team that is, their concept is to put modules onto the ISS, and then when the ISS decommissions, then that station will decouple from the ISS and become its own free-flying space station. So these companies and these teams, they're looking at a wide variety of who the customers might be to use these future space stations. And that's a challenge right now because there's a lot of unknowns, right? We don't know exactly what the market looks like for a lot of this, and that's risky for a lot of people that are trying to invest to get the amount of money that's required to build very large infrastructure in space. It's very expensive to send things to space. But luckily, due to a lot of the new launch vehicles coming online, a lot of you are familiar with many of the SpaceX's launch vehicles, and now we have Starship starting to have some test flights. But that's been a huge plus for the lower cost launching things to orbit, because that has always been a huge barrier to build any infrastructure up there. So that's really exciting for all the space companies. We can finally start bringing things up to low Earth orbit, and then now we can start bringing things onto the moon as well. Many of you are probably familiar with the Orion vehicle, which is part of the NASA Artemis program. And the Orion vehicle is designed by Lockheed Martin. And this vehicle is specifically designed to be a deep space crew transportation vehicle. And now this crew capsule sits on top of the NASA SLS rocket, and this is what will be bringing our astronauts back to the moon. Recently, we had the crew for the Artemis 2 mission was announced, so that's really exciting. They are slated to be launching in late 2024. And that mission will take 4 astronauts, and it will fly them around the moon. We'll do a flyby, and then they'll come back to Earth. The first mission we had was uncrewed. We were testing out the systems. It performed very well, so we're very pleased with that, and so we are on track for 2024. The follow-on mission, which will be the Artemis 3 mission, that is going to be the first mission that will bring humans back down to the surface of the moon. And on that mission, we will also have the first woman and the first person of color set foot on the lunar surface. So we're very excited about that. And one of the things I just kind of want to point out a little bit about the Orion crew vehicle. So this vehicle is specifically designed for deep space. So when we talk about that, some of the major differences is that this crew vehicle actually has to enable 4 crew to survive for up to 21 days inside of it without docking to anything else. So as a result, we have some additional life support systems that are inside of this, some navigation communication systems, a lot of redundant systems that we need when we're moving very far from Earth out to the moon. Additionally, there is extra radiation protection inside of this. There is a storm shelter that the astronauts can climb into if there are any solar particle events along the way during these missions, because to get out to the moon takes about 3 days if you're going direct there. So it's not like in low Earth orbit where if we think a solar flare is coming, that can hit our astronauts while they're outside of terrestrial here, being safe from radiation. They can't just come home right away. So that's another big design feature in the Orion vehicle. And last but not least, this vehicle has a very large heat shield. So when the Orion vehicle comes back from its trajectory from the moon, it's going to be flying very fast. A lot faster when it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere than a normal crew vehicle that would be orbiting in low Earth orbit. So another huge feature of this, and so we're very excited for all the future missions with Orion. And this is a fun picture of the Artemis 1 mission, where Orion was in the furthest most point in its orbit out around the moon, looking back at Earth. And there'll be some really wonderful views that the astronauts have when they go on their next mission. So what is the Orion going to do specifically when it brings people beyond low Earth orbit? Well, it's going to go out to the Gateway. The Gateway is a station that is getting built in cislunar space, so it'll be orbiting the moon. This is going to be smaller than the International Space Station. And this station, this will be where Orion docks to, and then this will also be where the lunar lander docks to, where the astronauts will transfer inside of the station to the lander that will then take them down to the surface of the moon. And additionally, this station, in the near future, as Paul was talking about, it will not be crewed all the time. The ISS has been continuously crewed since the beginning, and so the Gateway will only have crew there for certain periods of time, maybe only a month, maybe up to 6 months, but it will not be year-round. And so that also poses some additional engineering challenges that we have, as Paul mentioned, is dormancy. How do we create life support systems that can just, turn them off and everything works when the crew arrives and things get turned back on? So those are a lot of the challenges that a lot of engineers in the industry are working on right now as elements of the Gateway are getting designed and will begin launching soon. So we're very excited about that. Okay, so talking about crew transportation vehicles, let's begin to talk a little bit about habitats now. So one of the other technologies, as Paul mentioned, that we're working on at Lockheed Martin, in addition to some industry partners as well, we are working on inflatable habitat technology. We definitely see this as a very important piece of technology, as we mentioned, that's going to enable us to get to Mars. Mass is still going to be very important. The smallest amount of mass with the largest amount of volume. Nobody wants to be in a tiny little house for long periods of time. I think enough people lost their minds during COVID, so just imagine that for even longer, trying to go to Mars. But the inflatable technology, that's something that we're very excited about. I have a video here I'll show you about some testing we did recently. But some of the advantages of this as well is that, yes, we can fit with inflatable technology the same amount of volume in current fairing varying sizes inside of rockets that already exist, whereas if it was a metallic structure, to get the same amount of volume, it wouldn't fit inside the rocket. So that is a huge thing. It lowers the amount of launch costs, which is very important when you're designing architecture. And so if you can launch large amounts of volume, and potentially even a single launch on the right rocket, that is a huge cost savings. And yes, over 35 flights to just put the ISS together. So if you can imagine just having your own mini space station in only 1 or 2 flights, that's much more efficient. All right, and so why is this necessary technology? Well, we've talked about that a lot. Getting to the moon is still challenging right now in terms of the amount of mass and the cost and what it's going to take to get there. We're excited, obviously, at the big announcement today with the second lander design now, the team that gets to build that. And that's really going to also open up some new avenues for bringing more mass and these larger habitats and more surface infrastructure down to the lunar surface. And obviously the inflatable habitat, so we can configure this to be in on a surface habitat, in a gravity environment, a partial gravity environment, and then we can also configure it to work in a microgravity environment, so orbital or transit habitat. So this one does have a metallic core inside of it where we would put a lot of the systems, as Paul was talking about, and then you could take things out of the center and set everything up inside of it. So it does require some setting up after it gets deployed, but it does enable you to have a lot more volume and flexibility. And one of the things I will also touch on, as Paul mentioned, is that a lot of people think about an inflatable habitat, it's like living inside a bouncy house. It is definitely not. I will tell you, if you ever have the opportunity to actually see one in person that is fully pressurized, you can actually knock on the wall of it and it would sound very much similar to maybe a metallic hull or structure. It is very hard. And one of the things about the inflatable habitats, we have our own certification process we have to go through for those structures. Separate from certification process you have to go through for metallic structures. For soft good structures, we actually have to, well, we'll say metallic structures are required to meet a 2 times factor of safety when it comes to pressurizing them. So 2 times the amount of what you would ever pressurize it to for people to be inside of, it needs to withstand that. But for the inflatable structures, we're actually required to meet 4 times factor of safety. So it actually has to be pressurized way more than a metallic structure and still withstand that. And so in many ways, as was mentioned, it can be even stronger. All right, so now, fun little video to show you Lockheed Martin. The end of last year, we had one of our big testing milestones. We had our 1/3 scale burst test, and during this test, we took a subscale version of the habitat, and we pressurized it up to a maximum amount of pressure it could take until it burst. And what that gives us is a lot of data moving forward as we work to create full-scale versions of the prototype to understand, what are the max operating pressures of this on a full scale. And so we'll go ahead and play this real quick. So as you can see, we had a lot of cameras up all over the place to capture all of the different angles. And this was really important for us because we needed to see where exactly did it fail first in the structure. And where it failed in the middle was where we predicted it is where you want it to fail first. So the test went very well. We exceeded the 4 times factor of safety and got over 6 times factor of safety. So we feel very good moving forward with the additional tests we have to do and moving up to full scale, and in future iterations that we'll make with the inflatable structure as well. I mean, you definitely want something that has very high factor of safety when down the road, we want to begin putting penetrations into the structure with regards to windows or hatches and things of that nature where you're actually going into the side of it. So that'll be really important. So good news there. All right. Well, before I talk about this, actually, let me go back here. I just want to touch on a few things about the lunar surface and just kind of some general infrastructure and architecture things. We talk about putting habitats on the surface of the moon, but it's kind of like if you built a house out in the middle of nowhere with nothing around you, that probably wouldn't work out too well for you if you didn't have a way to get power, communications, if you didn't have a car. Probably wouldn't really have a great time or be able to do a whole lot. So it's very similar on the surface of the moon. In order for us to put a habitat there, a lot of surface infrastructure needs to be put in place first. And so as a result, Lockheed Martin is we're involved in a lot of different programs and contracts right now and different development efforts for various pieces of the architecture. Because for us, we see this as very holistic in nature. We're not just focusing on one. How do they all come together? So some of the projects that we're also involved in is the fission surface power, so as a power area. So we're looking into that because that's going to be some important power source that you're going to need when we're going to be operating at the lunar South Pole during the lunar night, as Paul talked about, especially when we'll talk about next, if you want to start doing some surface construction and you're going to have equipment and things that draw very high power levels. Those are things where just a solar array is not going to get you the amount of power that you need, or you won't be able to store enough power for a long period of time during the lunar night. So in addition to that, we're also involved in another program, a vertical solar array terminal. So very tall solar arrays that would get set up at the lunar South Pole, and they're far enough above the ground because the light it's like very low across the horizon there. So you don't get a lot of direct sunlight during parts of the year. And so these need to be high enough to reach the little bit of light that would shine through. So that's an area that we're also working on. Additionally, we are partnered with General Motors and another company, MDA, to work on developing a lunar rover. So it'll be kind of the next generation car for the astronauts to drive when they're there. And that'll be really important because we're going back to the moon. We want to do a lot of scientific exploration. We can only walk so far in spacesuits. That's not very comfortable. You don't want to walk far distances in those. So having a vehicle there to move you around the surface, being more efficient with the surface time that you have while the astronauts are there is going to be very important. Additionally, last but not least, we are also looking into communications and navigation network around the moon. That's going to be really important. Just like here, you want to have your cell phone, you want to talk to people, you want your GPS. Well, you're also going to need that on the moon if we want to send people there to stay. So one of the things we're working at Lockheed is a satellite network called Parsec that we'll be launching in a couple years, and that'll be a network around the moon, and then that'll provide communications and navigation relay. So we're definitely looking at the large picture here, and how do we provide the architecture to have astronauts and other nations and other companies and everyone send their astronauts there and be able to do things, because no one company is going to be able to afford to put that in place. So we'll put it there, and then other people can use it as needed. All right. So now that we've talked about the lunar surface, let's talk a little bit more about long duration missions going out to Mars, or long duration missions in space at any time. So one of the things I had the opportunity to be involved with, starting off my space career a little while back, was one of the analog missions that NASA does. It was a human exploration and research analog at Johnson Space Center in Houston. And this is one of the handful of analogs that occur around the country, around the globe. Some of them NASA sponsors, other ones are sponsored by other organizations. But these type of analogs and testing things out on the ground are really key for us to do before we take these technologies and send people to the moon or to space for long periods of time, or onwards to Mars. Like, these are definitely the place where you want to figure out what to do and what not to do. And so the one that I was involved in, this one in particular was a 6-week isolation confinement mission. And we lived inside of this little habitat here, probably about the size of like a 1-bedroom apartment for 4 people. We all met 2 weeks before this and trained together, and then proceeded to live in there for 6 weeks. And we were simulating long duration, a deep space exploration mission out to an asteroid, and it was a really interesting mission. They were doing a lot of different research was being done on us by researchers outside the habitat, but then we were also doing our own research inside, and it was definitely definitely a wonderful experience. Some of the things that we were doing, they were doing food studies, as was mentioned earlier. That's going to be really important for astronauts on long duration missions. You know, food's a really important part of our everyday lives, and that can, you know, affect you not only your health, but like also your mental and emotional headspace too. And so we were doing a food study. We were also doing a sleep deprivation study. That was super fun. And they were really trying to just understand what affects, like what's the cumulative fatigue effect on an astronaut. Like if we're asking them to work long hours, do EVAs, if they're not sleeping much, you know, what happens then? You know, will that cause a lot more chance of errors in the mission that could be life-threatening? And so that was another interesting part of the study. And one of the other things they were also doing is they were trying to study crew autonomy. And that's a really important thing that we don't think about a whole lot. It was mentioned previously here tonight about how there's going to be communication delays. When we send crews out to Mars, they're not going to be able to make calls back to Earth right away. You could have up to a 20-minute communication delay from the point that you call and ask a question that you have about a system in your spacecraft to the point that you receive an answer. So you better hope that that's not when an emergency is occurring and you need an answer right away. And so one of the things is throughout this mission that I was in, every day they were increasing to simulate the further out that you go, they were increasing the delays. We were talking to mission controllers outside of the habitat. And so it was very interesting, and they were trying to assess, can the crew function without us? Can we give them good directions about things to do? Like, can they be more autonomous and make their own decisions and change their schedule and do the research? And what do they do when emergencies happen? And so that was a lot of good research for them to gather on that. And last but not least, a huge part of this one in particular is focused on psychosocial and like personal interaction and how, like, what are the right types of skill sets but personality traits that you want to have in people that you send on a long duration mission. Not everybody you want to get locked up with for a long period of time. Some people are like, yeah, that's fine for like a trip to the moon for like, you know, a week or a few days. I can deal with that. But, you know, maybe going to Mars, not so much. Maybe even the person that you're like married to, maybe not. But anyways, so it was a lot of good research that was done in terms of when we all came out of this, you know, evaluating what are the traits that we think is best. And it might not be what you traditionally think is best. You might weigh certain traits higher, you might look for people of this types of mission. So, but all is to say, these analogs are continuing. The new one just began at Johnson Space Center. It's actually in the same building as this next door, and I think that'll be about a 1-year analog, and that one's going to be a much longer one. So that we'll be getting a lot of great data out of this. Next, human-in-the-loop testing. That opportunity I had there, Paul touched on that earlier. This was back in 2019. My previous company, I was involved in developing a prototype and bringing some NASA astronauts through that, and we were doing human-in-the-loop testing. We developed a whole internal prototype and yeah, basically a day in the life. We had NASA astronauts come, we kind of put them through, we had them do experiments inside, you know, run through emergencies, all kinds of things to just truly evaluate how do people use the inside of a habitat, because it may not be the same way that the designers intended it for it to be used. So we also tracked during this time the amount of space that people were wearing badges and monitors. And so we tracked, we did like a whole 3D imaging of how does the space get used? Are people using all this space? Do they migrate to a certain space more than other spaces? And, are they closer together at times and not at other times? And so that was all really valuable data that you use when thinking about how to design a habitat that's larger and for a longer duration mission. One of the other items that's going to be really important on these long duration missions is radiation protection. Now, one of the projects at Lockheed Martin that we had the fortune of collaborating on was with a company called STEMRAD, and they developed a radiation protection vest called AstroRad. And this vest here, this was flown on the International Space Station. So for about 2 years, this was up there, and we had crew members on the International Space Station trying out the vest, doing different things with it on, really just doing a lot of human factors evaluation and ergonomic study on, how comfortable this was and how would we adjust this. Now, the vest itself is not meant to be worn every day. This vest is meant to be worn more so in the event that there is a solar particle event, a solar flare, and the astronauts can't get back to Earth or can't get back to safety. So it's an additional layer of protection that they can wear. And the vest is designed, now it's a unisex vest, but it is designed to have special protection more so in certain regions for certain organs where you would have a lot more of your cells would be like reproducing during that time, where it's more prone to cancer, and if something happened, it would go very badly for you. So this vest covers those areas with different layers of protection in different areas for your organs. And here is a picture of, actually this was in one of the Israeli astronauts that was up there testing out the vest for us. And this was called CHARGE. It was Comfort and Human Factors, AstroRad Radiation Garment Evaluation, acronyms. But that was the name of that experiment on the ISS. Additionally, the other experiment that was done on the Orion vehicle was called MARE, Matroska AstroRad Radiation Experiment. And this we actually did in collaboration with not only STEMRAD, but also in collaboration with NASA and DLR, and then also the Israeli Space Agency. So this was a really wonderful project that was done, and essentially what we did was there was 2 mannequins, kind of phantom torsos, and they were placed inside of the Artemis 1 mission in the seats. This was an uncrewed mission. One was wearing a protection vest, the other one was not, and they all had a bunch of sensors and dosimeters on them to gauge the amount of radiation that was being received. And so because this capsule had traversed the furthest point from Earth that humans had ever traveled, and we didn't have data from that area in terms of what the radiation profile looks like, which we really need when we send astronauts there. This is really important. So the vests are back, and the researchers are going through all the information now, and we are very excited, and we look forward to getting all of that data. And that's really going to help us design for more safety for our astronauts for Moon and Mars missions. All right. So real quick, let's touch on other challenges of deep space missions. We talked about prolonged effects of being in 0G on your body. Yeah, not ideal when you want to get to Mars and you get out of your spacecraft and you can't really walk well. And so I think a lot of people have seen artificial gravity stations in many movies. These are some classic movies between, I think, Interstellar, 2001 Space Odyssey, The Martian. These are all different images of those. A lot of people ask, why don't we just build an artificial gravity station and take us to Mars? And I mean, I think that'd be great. But I will say one of the challenges with this is obviously the cost of building something to the size that you would need to have to actually get to Mars. And not have any negative effects. So one of the challenges with artificial gravity is if you were to do a spinning space station, a rotating one like the previous slide, it does need to be a very large diameter station. They've done a lot of studies to try to figure out at what point are there negative effects with your inner ear with some of the disorientation when you're having that centripetal force. And so the smaller the diameter can have more effects. And so the size of the station you need, it's kind of like the little green area, but that actually drives a very large station. And so right now, I mean, that's pretty cost prohibitive. And obviously, while we're getting launch vehicles, online that can start to bring more things to space, larger payloads, that's still going to be a challenge. So that's still a little ways out. I mean, there is another concept regarding tethers, where you could put things at either end, and you could spin them around. And that could be another possibility that also does present its own challenges as well for a mission to Mars. And so, while I don't think in the near future we'll be having artificial gravity to get to Mars, I know a lot of people are looking at that for low Earth orbit, and we'll see. I would love to see that happen, but I will say one of the other ways that we can try to reduce some of those effects is that we can look at other sources of propulsion, maybe try to get people there faster so that they aren't exposed to those levels of radiation or that amount of time in microgravity and zero G. And so one of the things that we're doing at Lockheed Martin, this is one of our concepts for the potential architecture for what a Mars transit vehicle may look like in the future. And one of the pieces of this architecture, aside from the inflatable you see in there, is we actually have a nuclear thermal propulsion on this. And that's another program that we're involved in at Lockheed Martin with our Draco program. And we definitely see the nuclear power as definitely a key enabling technology for a lot of their future space missions that we want to do. And these are some other fun concepts of what things might look like going to Mars or on the surface of Mars. And then I'm just going to kind of leave everyone with this fun visualization of what it might look like if you were inside one of those Mars transit vehicles. I think one of the things that excites us about building all this stuff with the vision of Mars is that not only is it Mars, it's the idea of what's beyond Mars, what's next. And so, I think at Lockheed Martin, we're very excited about the future of what this could look like. We absolutely understand that there's no one person or company that's going to achieve this by themselves. And, with that reason is why we work with NASA and other industry partners, academia. It's going to take everyone, all the brightest minds, for us to come together and really work on the solutions to these hard problems that's going to get us back not only to the moon, but onward to Mars. And so with that, I thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm here as an architect, but also as a space architect. My background is in architecture. I've worked in that field for several years, but more importantly, I've worked as an architect for many, many more years, designing buildings around the world of all types and scales and different typologies. And so space architecture for me means taking Earth with us to space. In the 1970s, visions of humanity going to space started to come together, some supported by NASA. What you see here is what it's called an O'Neill cylinder. This was developed as part of the big ambitions to take everything that we care about, everything that we use to support civilization out into space. And so that's been kind of like the core vision of space architecture since then. And of course, we all know that the ISS has been in orbit around the Earth, where a lot of science and different kinds of activities around human health and human physiology and the awareness of how human systems can function, live, and thrive in outer space. But really what's at the core of this is not too dissimilar from the way that we treat architecture on Earth. There's issues of environment, issues of habitability, and these can be broken down, of course, in the aerospace world into much more technical aspects of how we interface with the built environment. But in space architecture, what's unique is that we have to take this to the next level. We have to think about things like internal pressure, highly differentiated temperatures. We have to think about confinement. We have to think about health, like exercise, especially when it comes to the human physiology, because we're living in a completely different gravitational regime. And so these are some of the key drivers behind space architecture. And as a space architect, you have to become aware of all of these key drivers. You have to think holistically, you have to think systemically, but you also have to make sure that the environment that you're designing is inspirational. And so this is where architecture comes into place. First, you have to think about volume. Volume is a key aspect and a key driver of living in space, because having more of it means that you can do many more activities. Having less of it limits you. Also, there's environmental control systems, ecosystems, but lighting is one of the big ones, I would say. When you think about the human response to daylighting on Earth, we've evolved around that, so you have to try and maintain some of those cycles, the natural sleep and working cycles. And of course, when we think about space architecture, we have to integrate mechanical systems, equipment that's used by the astronauts. A lot of that has to do with different unique and diverse scientific and working activities. And so as a space architect, I work to integrate some of these. And so just to continue moving, there's many drivers behind space architecture. This is one example of a big vision for space architecture. So this is the orbital reef developed by Blue Origin. It's an ecosystem that is diverse in its technologies, diverse in the different partners that work on it. But more importantly, it really tries to put the human at the center with these large open spaces that can interconnect and bring a wide range of activities together. In the past, I've also had the opportunity to collaborate with academia and with industry. Some of the visions that I put together as a space architect, working on my own projects, have been around how do we use space architecture as a vehicle for different activities that go beyond science, things like entertainment, things like observation, things like hospitality. Can we push space architecture to the new frontier by bringing with us the different diverse activities that happen on Earth? And so this will also become the future. But when you think about that, you have to think, how can I integrate new materials? Because materials and technologies around manufacturing can enable different forms of architecture and different ways of integrating human aspects of it. So carbon fiber is a big one. This is a project, it's a research project that was developed together with NASA, where they were investigating carbon fiber. And carbon fiber promises to be one of the most lightweight but advanced materials for coming up with complex structures that can achieve multifunctional things. This is some of the test products that we developed in collaboration with the University of Manchester with Dr. Vivek Koncheri. So together, him and I were thinking, can we use carbon fiber and nanotechnology using graphene, differentiated structures with carbon fiber, 3D woven structures, and can we turn this into an efficient load-carrying envelope, basically a pressure vessel that could accommodate many penetrations like windows, so that you can have an observatory in space where you can do more than just the typical working functions. And so these are just some kind of illustrations showing how we think about the system, breaking it up, everything from the environmental protection system down to the window panes, thinking about the integration of thermal, and then even the interior finishes and how we can protect the inhabitants from interfacing with other materials. And so this is just one vision. There's many visions about this, but what it takes to get to this is you have to do a lot of the research and the material science and the testing. And now when we talk about surface architecture, we're talking about going to a destination where there's a lot more to contend with geographically. There's also dust. So one of the biggest issues on the moon is the factor that dust can damage lots of equipment. It's hazardous to humans, and it can make its way into your habitat structure. And we know from some of the missions like the LRO, the Selene, the Lunar Prospector, and the L-Cross, that there are specific regions where we can access resources like water which is hidden inside of the permanently shadowed regions. And so if we can identify very specific destinations, we can start to formulate architectures around going to that location. Just like on Earth, when we have a site, that site, it impacts your architecture. Your architecture wants to be site-specific and wants to be environmentally responsive, and these are considerations for the future. And so now surface architecture brings with it many more things than just habitation. You have to somewhat parametrically tie your architecture, your habitat, to other systems like transportation, robotic construction. We're talking about landers, we're talking about ECLIS, in situ resource utilization. And so these are just technologies that you have to bring with you. Some of them you bring with you before, and some of them you bring with you after you have some human presence. It really depends on the level of sophistication. And so these will be proving grounds for us. Initially, it will start with small prospecting missions. We identify the resources, we identify the location, and then we start to bring other elements like power and communications, small surface hubs, logistics, and things like that. And then we can start to scale that up. It's not too dissimilar from the way that we approach architecture in extreme environments on Earth. In the Antarctic, for example, there's many stations. The Antarctic is basically it's like a continent for experimentation where many countries around the world have developed different facilities, and these are all focused on understanding the Earth and what climate change is doing to it. So to get there, you have to build a lot of these buildings before you actually build them. That means prefabrication. Often in other parts of the world, you ship them on boats, and when you get them there, you have to install them, and every step of the way has to be methodically designed and developed. And so construction techniques have a huge role to play in this. These are some examples of those stations. And you can see just inherently in the form, these are all prefabricated systems. Some of them you can see are really large. Some of them are elevated, often elevated because they need to be jacked up. And the snowpack starts to accumulate. And if you don't continuously jack up the habitation, you basically get covered in snow. And so when it comes to surface architecture, there's a lot of technology gaps that we're trying to overcome. And there's a really, I would say like a really well-documented taxonomy of technologies that NASA has produced. And these are areas where people like us, our space architects, engineers, scientists, can start to collaborate on bridging those gaps. And so I've identified a few of them in particular that I've been interested in throughout my career. And these have a lot to do with habitation systems. And if you take a deeper dive into these, you can really get into what exactly are the specific details that you need to develop around these technologies. One of those technologies is enclosure systems or pressure vessels. And so we've heard, Ellie talk about inflatable systems, and we've also seen a lot of rigid technologies evolve. And in one of the projects that I had the chance to work on with the European Space Agency was the Moon Village habitat, where we came up with, it's a very large scale habitat. This is looking further into the future, but it's a 4-story hybrid composite system. We have a metal frame, which is an exoskeleton. It supports the floor systems. And then we have an inflatable shell, which is a 3-lobe system, inspired by many pressure vessel technologies. And we went through this process of doing what's called a concurrent design facility study. We studied everything from the way that you deliver a habitat of this scale down to the installation and the outfitting and operations. And so this is an image just to capture some of the work that was done. We designed the vehicles, we designed the landers, we designed the habitats, but more importantly, we designed the human environment, which is the interior of the habitat. And I'm gonna show you guys a video which really goes into detail on how this journey could take place when we get to this scale of architecture. If it plays. Yeah, there we go.
More than 50 years have passed since humans last traveled to the moon, and there's still much we don't know about the brightest object in our night sky. What would it mean to return to the moon today? To leave more than flags and footsteps? To create a sustainable home? It would open new avenues for science. It could kickstart an outer space economy. and it would allow us to create a new kind of community, to discover how we might live together beyond the Earth. The European Space Agency's concept for a moon village is an international endeavor, bringing together governments, industry, and perhaps private entrepreneurs to support a permanent human presence on the moon. If an earlier era of space exploration was driven by competition, this one will be defined by collaboration. What would it take to truly thrive in space? How can we make the moon feel like home? Built from a rigid composite frame and an inflatable structural shell, the habitat maximizes usable space and creates a sense of openness on 4 levels. The first phase of development will allow crews to live, work, and continue building the settlement. Gradually, additional infrastructure and equipment will arrive, and new habitation units can serve functions such as food production and science operations. Eventually, the Moon Village will grow into a thriving community, a hub for science, exploration, and even tourism. Visible from everywhere on Earth, the moon has always given humans something to aspire to, a place to set our sights on. And soon, it will be a place we might call home.
So this was narrated by Jeffrey Hoffman. He's an ex-NASA astronaut. He worked very closely with us. I just want to emphasize that a big role of an architect is to tell stories, to bring together many ideas, and to bring people on board. So it's a mix of both art, science, technology, and we don't have all the solutions. But what we do is we try to inspire ways of thinking that can bring new ideas to the table. Another project I had the privilege of working on with Lockheed Martin at my previous role with SOM was a research project where we try to emphasize a small-scale habitat that would be something that would be a low-mass solution, really mostly focused on the interior aspects of this design. We call this project New Frontiers. And in our research, we looked at what the current thinking about space habitation is, including the ISS, the gateway, and you can see that in this architecture, there's a kind of typology happening where you have racks that surround you, there's a corridor, and pretty much you're confined to this space, and there's, of course, other accommodations, but we wanted to find a way to think differently about surface habitat based on some of the research that we had done. And so, again, looking at human-centered design, we looked at things like the environment, habitability, equipment, crew systems, how people would move through the habitat and how they would exit. And as part of that, we also look at deploying things like computational design, where we look into 3D geometry, optimizing geometry, coming up with various solutions. It's almost like optioneering. That's one of the key phrases that we use in the field of architecture, where there's no one solution, but we actually explore at many solutions, sometimes thousands of solutions by using computational design. And the result of this project was a space which really tried to emphasize the use of materials, the use of lighting, and the use of interfaces throughout that would make clear what your interaction with that habitation system could be. And lighting is a big one because, again, circadian rhythms, we're used to living and thriving on Earth because of the rise and the fall of the sun. And so we want to be able to manage and simulate some of those things in space when we're in a confined environment. In addition to that, we also want to provide things like privacy and common spaces. So if you can create architecture that is dynamic and that people can interface with, you can also start to give agency to how they reconfigure their spaces. The spaces are not predefined, but can be actually reconfigured by the user. And some of these things we use in the building industry already. And so this project really led us to thinking about the ergonomics, the way that people would live inside of the space, and we put together. Oh, sorry, I think it just closed. If you want to bring it up, so we put together a really interesting study that has been published, and you can find it online. But if you're interested to learn more about this project, feel free to reach out, and I can send you some information about it. Thank you for the time.
Okay, and now for something completely different. Still got a few Monty Python fans in the audience, that's good. Make it, don't take it. That's a tagline that we have used for the in-space manufacturing project at the Marshall Space Flight Center for almost a decade now. But when you start considering extraterrestrial construction, that thought process takes on additional significance and additional impacts. At Marshall, we began working on in-space manufacturing and extraterrestrial construction back in the 2004 timeframe. And at that point in time, we were supported by the Office of Biological and Physical Research at NASA headquarters, and they were responsible for the physical science research and microgravity research that took place on space station. We were part of that group. They had a significant budget cut. A little bit later, this in situ fabrication repair was the name of our project. It lasted a little bit less than 2 years, and it was collateral damage when all the space station work was cut. However, in that 2 years, we learned a great deal. And I believe now that the agency has embraced the need to have in-space manufacturing and extraterrestrial construction, and I'll show you why in a couple of charts. Okay, as Paul had, Paul had covered earlier, the Moon to Mars exploration strategy and objectives. I'm going to talk about and highlight several of those objectives because they have very major significance into what I'm going to be talking about. And then we're going to work our way down through the other programmatic layers till we get down to where the work is actually going on in the laboratories. And I want to show how that relates to the bigger picture that you've heard already. Now I want to warn you, we are going to do a technical deep dive. So just be aware, when we get to it, we're going to be talking serious technical stuff. Okay. As Paul mentioned, and I want to take a step back because I love the way this strategy is put together. I was very fortunate earlier in my career to have a boss that impressed upon me the importance of managing for the outcome that you want. And that's exactly what this strategy does. It architects from the left. Now, we all hope that we will be able to stick with the plan, but that's the plan. I want you to focus on the first objective, and I've collected some of these objectives. There are 63 of those that relate to in-space manufacturing and relate to extraterrestrial construction. Okay, what stands out to me in that first statement is the first word, demonstrate. Then next, you see advanced manufacturing and autonomous construction capabilities called out specifically. Then you see a continuous human lunar presence. And then finally, you see a robust lunar economy. That's a rich statement. That's a powerful statement. For those of us that have been working in this area for so long, it's wonderful to see yourself in the second statement is also something that I think is very critical, that we're talking about the maximization of the use of the lunar resources. And also we see again a sustainable human presence, a continuous robotic and human presence on the surface of the moon. Now the other ones that I've collected there deal with maintainability, reliability, the effects of the lunar environment on the hardware, on the processes, and on the materials. But going down to the bottom two, which are in the operations categorization of the objectives, what we see again is the re-emphasis of not launching materials from Earth. It's expensive. The going rate today for the CLPS landers is about $1 million a kilogram. But anything that we do launch from Earth, we want to make sure that it's reusable and recyclable. Okay. Ellie touched on this, Paul touched on this. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time, but I do want to walk down, like I said, through the programmatic layers. So we've had the first successful Artemis mission. We've named the crew for Artemis 2. They're going to orbit the moon, and then they're going to come back. And then, as Ellie said, Artemis 3 will put the first woman and first person of color on the surface of the moon. Then we have 2 other Artemis missions in what is being called Phase 1 for Artemis. That's Artemis 4 and Artemis 5. They will continue to build up the gateway, and they will also have extended surface missions on the moon. Now, at the same time that these missions are going on, the Space Technology Mission Directorate and the Science Mission Directorate also have missions to the moon. You can see there, we've identified, I think we've identified on this one, or we should have, Prime and Viper. They're going to be prospecting for resources in the South Polar region. Next, we move into Artemis Phase 2, and that's the development of the capabilities and the infrastructure that begin to support a sustained human presence on the surface of the moon. You can see the things and the different elements that have been mentioned so far: pressurized rover, lunar terrain vehicle, oxygen pilot plant that will be capable of producing about 10 metric tons of oxygen per year, the nuclear surface fission power, the inflatable habitat. These are the beginnings of the infrastructure, and these will be in place in the second phase of Artemis. Now, at the same time these are going on, this is when the investments for the Space Technology Mission Directorate, STMD, start to kick in. They've divided their work, their investments, in 4 key areas: go, land, live, and explore. For go, they're focusing on space transportation and propulsion. For land, it's precision landing for science experiments and heavy cargo, heavy payload. Live is covered there by those focal areas in blue under the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative. We're going to be talking specifically about excavation, construction, and a new element that's been added that's not on the chart. Paul talked about it, and that's outfitting. And then just finally to note, in-space manufacturing is covered under Explore, and it's picked up over there on the right-hand side under Advanced Manufacturing. Okay, this is our vision for lunar construction. This is our architecting from the right. This is our managing for the outcome that we want. You can see in the foreground there is a piece of construction equipment. It's constructing a landing pad. Now, a recent concept study that we went through made it very clear to us that the monolithic slab that we're thinking about, and most people might, for a landing pad, is not an efficient structure. It's wasteful in time, it's wasteful in energy, and it's wasteful in resources. So what we're going to do is to create, and we're now designing, a topology optimized landing pad. So that's a representation of it. It's not the final design, but I can pretty much assure you the landing pad we build on the moon will not be a monolithic slab. A little bit further in the background, you see another piece of construction equipment. It's making a road. And then further in the background, you can see another piece of construction equipment that's making a habitat. Now, these are roughly in the chronology that we see these capabilities being developed on the surface of the moon. We'll start with the planar structures like the habitats, the landing pads and the roads, and then we'll move to the larger, more complex vertical structures like the habitats. And as you would see, if you looked at any construction site on the Earth, you would see multiple pieces of equipment doing multiple functions for the development of whatever project that is. We envision the same thing for the moon, specific capabilities for specific applications on the surface of the moon. We want to make sure that we develop the right tools for these jobs. Now, the grand vision, as we have already seen in the Moon to Mars objectives, create a robust lunar economy. In order to do that, we have to have a sustained human presence. In order to have a sustained human presence, we have to have infrastructure. And it's not just the civil engineering structures. We need all the things that Ellie has talked about and Paul has talked about and Daniel has talked about. We need power. We need oxygen. We need water. We need environmental control life support systems. We need communications, on and on and on. For the civil engineering structures, we have partnered with a commercial company, Icon Technologies, out of Austin, Texas, and their goal is to be able to provide this on-demand infrastructure at the beginning of the next decade, early in that decade. Now, in order to do that, the first step is to demonstrate this capability through a CLPS lander. And CLPS is Commercial Lunar Payload Service, and NASA has that contract out to a number of CLPS providers that will provide the ride down to the surface of the moon. In order to do that, we have to have a lot of partners. Ellie mentioned this. We have expertise all over the country that are helping us to be able to develop this first payload that we will deliver, and it's ready to go to the moon to demonstrate this construction capability. And I'll talk about those partnerships a little bit later on. We will develop the capability to emplace these different types of infrastructure in a phased approach. We're in phase one now. We're developing things like excavation and consolidation for processes on the regolith. Those are being done on Earth, and we will translate them to the lunar surface. The end of phase one for us, for construction, will be the proof of concept demonstration of the material deposition system. Then we'll move into phase two. And in phase two, we'll start making functional structures, operational structures like landing pads and roads and so forth. Then we'll move into phase three, where we start to build the vertical structures. And if you can see, where is that? Right here. That's concept, an architectural concept of a lunar base camp that was developed by the Bjarke Ingels group for Icon for this project. What you can't see outside that circle is a solar farm and a greenhouse to the left and to the right. I mentioned outfitting earlier. Where we have this blue circle, you can see the astronauts living and working inside the habitat. You see a lot of other things there. So for us, the way we define outfitting is what it takes to turn a house into a home. Look at all those things that the astronauts have around them: tables, chairs, workbenches, sleeping platforms, you name it. Those have to come from somewhere. So we either launch them to the surface of the moon, or we take advantage of the resources there and the capabilities that are there and make as much of these things as we can. So that's what we mean when we talk about outfitting. And then for phase four, we move into the lunar settlement with full construction capability, vertical and horizontal. Okay, this is Space Technology Mission Directorate's plan for how we begin to emplace those capabilities on the surface of the moon, and they're focusing on key infrastructure. We can see here the prime, good, I'm glad it didn't change. The prime mission and the Viper mission, again, they're prospecting for resources in the South Polar region. And then we come to CT1, which is Space Technology Mission Directorate's first focused mission to bring these technologies to the surface of the moon and demonstrate those. And these are infrastructure elements. They're starting with oxygen generation, the pilot excavator that will provide the regolith that will feed the oxygen generation. There's also VSAT, Ellie mentioned that, vertical solar array technology to provide the power, and then there's surface construction. For CT2, we advance and scale up the oxygen production, and we scale up the surface construction. And that's a big scale up for surface construction. And I'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later on. And again, in the early part of the next decade, nuclear fission, surface power, and also the pilot oxygen plant that should produce 10 metric tons per year of oxygen. So we developed the Moon to Mars Planetary Autonomous Construction Technology Project. That's IMPACT, it's a mouthful. But it really clearly states what our objective is, developing technologies that we can demonstrate on the moon that translate forward to Mars. We want to be able to protect the astronauts from the lunar environment. We want to do that by producing the infrastructure using the regolith that's there on the surface of the moon. Shown on the lower right, this is our concept for our element of the CT-1 mission that does the construction. You can see that we're operating from the deck of the lander, and that was an intentional decision. The primary focus of this mission is to make sure that the material deposition system works on the surface of the moon and the lunar environmental conditions. We don't need the complexity of a mobility system. We don't need the complexity of having an interface with the excavator to get our build material, and we'd really like to stay away from the dust to make sure that it doesn't foul our equipment. It's very aggressive. So we're operating from the deck of the lander. We also have other objectives that we need to accomplish on this mission. Number one, we need to characterize the regolith in the area where we land. We really don't know the constituency of the regolith in the South Pole. We have good ideas, but we don't know exactly because we've never brought home regolith from the South Pole. We also need to be able, well, and when we understand that, we're going to do a series of experiments on the Earth to sort of bound what we think that might be. So once we get on the moon, we hit it with a spectrometer, we find out what the chemistry makeup is of that. We may need to adjust our process parameters to produce the optimum material on the surface of the moon. We're going to exercise our instrumentation in process monitoring that will evolve to in-process control. We're going to demonstrate remote and autonomous operations. And a very key objective, we're simulating multiple things on the surface of the Earth. We're simulating the regolith chemistry, and we're simulating the lunar environment. We need to be able to understand if these simulations are actual sufficient analogs for the surface of the moon operations. That's a key objective. And then looking forward, we want to identify technology gaps, and we want to be able to provide data that will anchor our analytical models to feed forward into the next generation. Before we began the project, we did an industry-wide survey by an organization called Get2, and we asked them to provide us information on emerging materials and emerging construction processes that we could use on the moon. And this is a representation of the categories of materials that they gave us. And I want to run down through these pretty quickly and tell you the pros and cons and where we are with those. First of all of these materials that we're looking at can be found on the moon in the regolith, but in various amounts, with one exception, and that's the polymers. And I'll get to those in a second, tell you why we're looking at those. The cementitious materials, we're developing the binder for those. You use regolith as the aggregate for the lunar concrete. We've looked at a variety of those: calcium sulfoaluminate, sulfur concrete, sulfur nickel concrete, magnesium oxysilicate. Those have the problem in that if you're going to build a large structure, you're going to have regolith beneficiation capability on an industrial scale to produce the different constituents that make up your binders. Some of these cementitious materials will also require environmental control. So they've got a lot of challenges to face and to overcome before they become a construction material we can use on the moon or Mars. Geopolymers, that's sodium silicate, sodium hydroxide, not in the typical sense you would think of a polymer. Penn State's doing that work for us. It's shown a lot of promise and a lot of development. They even have an experiment on space station that they will be evaluating how the geopolymer works in a microgravity environment. However, it also requires beneficiation of regolith. It also requires environmental control. Thermosetting materials, what that meant to us was aluminum. That's what was recommended. It'll be a long time before we have an aluminum plant on the surface, but when it's ready, we'll certainly build with it. Now we move into the directed energy or the thermal processes. These require no materials to be launched from the surface of the Earth. We're looking at regolith melting and extrusion. It's basically, you put regolith in a furnace, you heat it up, it melts, you extrude it, you build your structure. Much like a fused deposition modeler and additive manufacturer would do, only with plastic. And then there's also the idea of melting the regolith and forming tiles, and then knitting the tiles together when you place them on the surface of the moon. That work's being done by Astroport, and that's a small company in San Antonio. We keep touch with them. Laser sintering is being developed by Icon. It's very much like laser powder bed fusion that's used in advanced manufacturing on the Earth, with two key differences. We don't know the constituency of the powder, and we don't have any control over the particle size distribution. We've got to work with whatever we've got on the surface of the moon. And then finally, microwave centered. We're looking at a couple of techniques there, and lately they've shown a lot of progress. We're very encouraged about taking those forward and developing the TRL even further, because I think they've got great potential. And just real quickly, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, this is a preliminary design, an architectural concept done by the Bjarke Ingels group for their vision of a habitat. Shown right below that is the same thing that was done by Space Exploration Architecture, or SEARCH. And then over here is an architectural concept for a lunar landing pad printer that was developed by Icon. Okay, real quickly, we reached out to NASA's Engineering and Safety Center, NESC, to help us determine a good screening matrix for the mechanical and the thermal performance to evaluate these materials. We didn't want anybody to think we were grading our own papers and making the down select. And this is the test matrix that we came up with. Compression at room temperature, compression at the extremes of the polar region, compression after we've cycled it in the lunar environment thermally for 1 lunar year or 13 cycles, tension, thermal expansion, flexural strength, and also thermal performance. The thermal performance tool that we use was called Plasma Torch Test Facility. We've used that at Marshall literally for decades to test solid rocket motor nozzle materials, solid rocket motor insulation, and the Kennedy Space Center even sent us pieces of a landing pad that we could use this to test. So the way we determined how we should do this is we calculated the heat flux from the engine of a very large cargo lander for the CLIPS program. We put a safety factor on that, and then we exposed the materials to that heat flux for a period of 5 seconds. And if we're lucky, that'll show up in the next video. Okay, on the right-hand side is a video of the test. You can see the test articles on the left-hand side. We have 2 different types of test articles, and by the way, these were laser-centered. On one set, we machined the surface to get a flat face. On the others, we exposed it to the plasma torch in the as-built configuration. Now, the good news for us for this test, this particular material performed exceptionally well. There was virtually no erosion of this material, and the weight loss that we measured was at the 2nd decimal place, and I'm talking hundredths of a %. So we're very pleased with that. So as of this time, and we announced this to STMD about 2 months ago now, we've selected laser melting as our baseline for CT1 application. And we've done this for a number of reasons. Number one, it is the most versatile. It can do horizontal structures, it can do vertical structures. It's one of the most efficient, and by that I mean we don't have to take materials from the Earth. It's the most mature. It was when we made the decision, and it still is today. And then finally, it is extensible at scale to larger structures. To date, we've been limited by the size of our vacuum chamber, but we know that the physics works because our physics model, our physics-based model, agree very well with the glass ceramic materials that we've been producing. We will be scaling up to, let's call it a mid-scale thermal vacuum chamber this summer to be able to produce and test more materials before we move into the very large simulated lunar environmental test. That is our next step. The Marshall Space Flight Center has a 20-foot diameter by 28-foot deep thermal vacuum chamber. We're outfitting that with a tray filled with lunar regolith, or a regolith bed for us. And we're going to be testing this hardware in that environment. And it does a good job of simulating the lunar environment as far as it goes. It does a really good job with the temperature. It does a really good job with the vacuum. It'll go to 10 to the minus 6 or 7 torr. On the moon, we're looking at 10 to the minus 12 or 13, but that's good enough. What we cannot simulate is all three of those factors at one time. We can't bring in the effect of partial gravity, but we can do that analytically, and we are. So we will be doing a test later this fall. We'll bring in what we call the terrestrial arm. It's not a flight weight arm or a flight weight design. It's simply a functional robot arm to demonstrate the kinematics and demonstrate the thermal control that we will need to understand. And a stretch goal for that test would be able to do a little bit of site prep, excavation, sieving, sorting, dispensing, and so forth. Our next test will be a full-up development level test. This will be a test of the system. It will be a ground-rated system, but it will perform the same functions that we're expecting from this in the lunar environment. We'll make a representative piece of the landing pad. We'll make test articles to test thermally and mechanically. We'll do site prep. We'll do sieving, sorting. We'll test out the spectrometer. We'll test out the instrumentation. We will run it through its paces like it were on the moon to make sure that when we get there, we've done the best we can on Earth to simulate that environment and these operations. I mentioned earlier that we had partners, and we do. These are our partners all across the nation that are helping us and bringing their expertise to the table because this is a very complicated problem. We're working with other government agencies, primarily the Air Force, other NASA centers, particularly the Langley Research Center that's working on the instrumentation, and Kennedy Space Center that's working on the site prep activities for us. We're working with large businesses like Blue Origin. We have a cooperative agreement with them. They're helping us with landing pad design and requirements. We're also working with small businesses like Icon. They're developing the hardware. They're also developing one of those process technologies, the laser centering. We have lots of different universities across the country, large universities, community colleges, even working with us to help with this complex problem. And that's really where we are. I know you've seen the Moon to Mars strategy in several places. I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's an excellent plan. And I do want to remind you of those last two objectives. In-space manufacturing, extraterrestrial construction are called out in those objectives. We've got a lot of work to do, as I hope you've been able to understand from my talk. We can get there, but the important thing is, if you look at the logistics, we don't need to leave home without these capabilities. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions.
My name is Eric Enig. I am a member. I've been a member, I think, since sometime in the 1980s. A couple comment and a question. So Corky, I didn't see Georgia Tech up there. They've got a great vacuum chamber. DARPA funded it. It's pretty substantial in size. Anyway, Paul, you mentioned radiation several times. And so I was, when your colleague who was giving the presentation on architecture, space architecture, was talking about the habitat. I'm wondering, are you giving any consideration, there's no magnetosphere on the moon, around the moon, are you giving any consideration to maybe putting that down inside of a lava tube, that you may not have the luxury of building these on the surface?
Yeah, there's been a lot of consideration over the years in regards to the architecture and making concepts that are either buried in lava tubes or actually buried under at least, I think it's a meter of regolith that's needed, something along those lines, to actually shield you from the radiation. There has been a lot of consideration on that. I think there are some challenges that are also associated with that, but even Corky probably could mention there's some in situ resource utilization of the surface to build those kind of structures as well, like berming and other things like that. It's not off the table. I think it's still something that's totally on the table. But as the initial mission that we're talking about with regards to the surface of the moon, we probably might not go that direction. That doesn't mean that we can't outfit it later. Do you have anything to add, Corky?
Is the blue microphone somewhere?
I would just note one thing. You might have noticed, if you remember the Bjarke-Ingels concept for the toroid had those pockets in there. One of the functions of those pockets was to put lunar regolith in it and help as a radiation shield. So they did think about that.
Good evening. My name is Dean Phillips. I'm not a member yet. My question is I noticed in the materials discussion, the manufacturing discussion, you didn't bring up use of biologicals. And I'm wondering whether that is because you don't think it's practical or because it's just not part of the process that you're thinking currently. What's the future for that?
That's a good point, and I can tell you that the little bit that I know about that, and we have done some work with Stanford, Dr. Lepech, Dr. Lepic, and also with Ames Research Center. They completed a cooperative agreement with us, and ironically, it was on outfitting. Their focus was the use of biological materials that could be used to form what they call pods. And those pods are individually designed living areas. And they did a fantastic job on that. So the answer is not no. It's just that we're not far enough along yet with that process to make it a candidate right now for this application. But we do think there's a lot of promise there, and we did fund the can, and I'll tell you, we're really very impressed with the work that they produced using biologicals.
Dr. Michael Cole, I'm
Phone and the blue microphone.
in emerging technologies, not a member. What about water extraction techniques, processes, infrastructure on the moon?
I'm sorry,
Water extraction.
Oh, water extraction? That's the focus of both the Prime and the Viper missions. They're out there prospecting for water. I think everybody is aware that there's a lot of expectation that there will be water in the permanently shadowed regions. If that's so, it makes life a lot easier if we're able to extract that and then process it. A couple of the cementitious materials that I mentioned, the calcium sulfoaluminate, the magnesium oxysulfate, and also what was the other one? The geopolymers require water. So if we can get access to the water, that solves one of their problems. But it really doesn't solve the other problems for construction, which is you need the industrial scale beneficiation I was talking about to create those other constituents. And then for some of those, you also need an environmental enclosure because the material just doesn't work in those lunar extreme temperatures or in a vacuum. You'll wind up with foam.
Hi, my name is Ajay Kothari. I'm a member. First of all, congratulations to the Lockheed and Blues Origin team. Hearty congratulations and also to the NASA folks for doing that. My question is, I think one of the things that was mentioned was that the Blue Moon would be going from LEO to NRHO, and by the time it reaches NRHO, it'll be empty of fuel, and then it'll be refueled at NRHO. So my question is, where would that propellant come from at NRHO to refuel those two, Mark 1 and Mark 2, that would eventually be going to the lunar surface and back, etc.? Where would that propellant come from? I mean, do you have plans for propellant tanks also in there?
Well, I'd be happy to point you to where that information exists after the talk, but I can't speak to that directly. Sorry about that.
My name is Scott Matthews, and I'm a member. I work for the U.S. Navy. We have huge programs in additive manufacturing and 3D printing. So we very much buy into the don't take it, make it. What we have found is that all of these processes, additive manufacturing processes, are prone to huge numbers of defects. And doing some sort of an analysis after a structure is printed, usually X-ray tomography or something like that, is incredibly crucial. You know, the other thing that we sort of appreciate is that if you are 3D printing a desk chair, nobody really cares if it has some defects in it. If you are 3D printing the shaft in a turbine engine and it has defects in it, you've got very serious problems. If you are now going to be making structures that are going to be, you know, load bearing in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of being, you know, vacuum tight, what are the considerations for evaluating and measuring defects on the surface of the moon?
You bring up an excellent point, and you're absolutely right on. One of the challenges that we face is to evaluate the mechanical capability of the material that we make. We don't have any Instron machines on the surface of the moon. We are looking at what we're calling the PAT, the Performance Assessment Tool. That's one of the reasons that we do have 4-point bend in there, is that it's probably the simplest mechanical test we can run. We're also evaluating an acoustic emission test out of the Colorado School of Mines that may be able to provide us the elastic modulus. And we're looking with Kratos Southern Research Engineering about the possibility of doing a compression test. Now, I've got my doubts on that one, but they're pretty smart folks, and they're helping us try to find our way. In terms of NDE methodology, for this first test, it's simply a proof of concept for the material deposition system, but we do have conversations ongoing with Langley. We have a microwave camera that's in development under an SBIR with I think it's the University of Iowa or Iowa State. They're working with the Langley Research Center. And for missions following this one, we're going to have to increase our instrumentation to be able to, number one, inspect the surface as we produce it. And that's something that we're doing on the fabrication laboratory that we're working on to provide in-process inspection. And we're going to have real-time controls that we can go back and fix that layer before we move on. So those are the things that are under consideration and that we're actively looking at. But for this first mission, that's a complexity that we just didn't get into. I hope that answers it.
I just want to piggyback on that real quick. Yeah, I think, what was being shown, I mean, that's like the longer term vision, right? That's the vision. I think you bring up a good point. Yeah, I mean, I don't think initially won't be able to have hold the atmosphere inside. So I think it'll be a phased approach. I think we're going to have the habitats that Paul and myself were talking about initially, and then once we get the 3D printing, we'll probably print around one of those habitats. So you'll have an atmosphere inside a pre-existing habitat, because then the importance at that point is you want to have the radiation protection as you have longer stays on the surface if you're not going to be underground or in a lava tube. And so I think then that'll be the kind of bridge the gap in eventually when we get to the point where we can have that.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more too. There is leak rates that do happen on ISS and on any of these habitable volumes. There is. Now, that's not to say that your question is still not extremely valid, because it still is, especially over long-term period of time, whether or not those structures are going to hold up. And another challenge that exists that's even outside of that is maintaining these systems in a thermal and a power way. You have to implement systems that you can actually outfit with those systems in mind, right? You have to have the thermal to power as well as the atmospheric control. And all of those systems have to be able to be implemented in that, and that's something to consider as well.
Thanks, Larry. We have a question from Eric, who is streaming from Sweden. Eric wants to know, what is the probable in situ resource utilization fuel from the moon? Hydrolox from splitting water? Any other ideas?
If I understood the question right, he's asking about the production of propellant on the surface of the moon, and that would be liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. If there's water there, certainly we'll be able to produce that. There's also, I think, solar wind implanted hydrogen in some of the areas, but that's in a very small concentration.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm not a member. So it seems to me there's a few big questions that we still have ahead of us as we're looking to go to Mars and even the moon, like radiation, the health effects of low gravity, even life support systems. And it seems like some of these could even be addressed already on the space station. Like I found out, at least a couple of years ago, the space station life support is not a fully closed system yet. I don't know if that's changed yet, or if there's a timeline to address that. I mean, we haven't even had someone in space for the full length of time that a Mars mission would take. I was just wondering, like, are there plans to start looking at these things with the resource we even have right now with, like, the space station?
Yeah, in terms of environmental control and life support systems, there is a lot of research that's being done at Marshall Space Flight Center for closing that as well. And there is some closure that's happening on ISS already right now, and there are your ability to do water processing and things like that do exist. There are still some challenges that are related to that, and I do want to emphasize that when in my discussion, it was the emphasis that these are challenges, not that there are no mitigations at all, but that these are challenges that need to be faced in some way that we can reduce these and mitigate these even in a better fashion, especially when we start doing these long duration missions to places like Mars. I think that's something that you're really bringing up here, right? And that's important. We have to develop those systems, we have to close the loop appropriately, but we have to be able to then test out those systems and make sure that they're going to last the long haul when we start sending humans to Mars. I don't think they're monumental challenges that we can't really overcome. I just think that they're things that we need to invest in, and that's the real reason why we do the strategic analysis cycles, is that we're trying to identify the areas by which we need to grow those capabilities to the proper TRL, the technology readiness level, for those that don't want to hear the acronyms. And in order to accomplish that's something that's able to be communicated back to our leaders so that they can rebalance their portfolios to make sure that they're putting the funding in the proper places to meet the times that we're trying to go after things. It's important to consider in all of these regimes, right? There's time on system that sometimes you cannot buy back with money. An example of that would be electric propulsion or something like that. You need to have a system that's going to last multiple years, so you're going to have to test it for a very long period of time. You can't buy back that schedule. But there are areas where you can buy back schedule and you can rebalance your portfolio to do that. And so there is a lot of research going on in all of these areas. It's just that this is a very major challenge, especially when we're talking about long duration living.
I'll just add on to that. You know, with some of the new commercial space stations that are in development right now and coming online, that's going to be a really great platform and opportunity to be testing out a lot of these systems that we want to use for deep space. You know, right now, I mean, the ISS is existing. It's pretty full. I mean, there's not enough space for all the research we want to do there. And so when we have more stations on orbit, now we can have modules where, you know, it doesn't have to be the whole station. You could just block off a module. You saw the size of Orbital Reef, you know, and you could have a module that just has that life support system so that you're not subjecting a whole crew of people to that if something malfunctions, and you can do it for long term. And then the other thing is, I mean, Paul, is there anything, do you want to talk about any of the, I don't know, plans or things at the gateway or phased things for Mars eventually? I know there's been some discussions about, you know, maybe getting ready for Mars or testing at the gateway or extending time there, but. Yeah, I mean, Gateway is providing us that initial habitation capability at this point, but the idea is that you would develop this transit habitat, and this is really gets, I think what you're getting at here, is to that point of testing out those systems. Well, how would you do that? You would develop the system that you're looking at taking to Mars. You're going to have to test out those systems. One of those areas to do that is connected to something like the Gateway, where you could do what we call shakedown missions, where we're just taking it out to sea, seeing whether or not it's totally seaworthy. We could also run operations from something like a transit habitat that's connected to Gateway. It gives us a lot of capability within a larger volume to be able to do operations on the lunar surface. And so you could even test out the operations that you might do at Mars, and as well test out all the systems that are necessary, and then have that backup on Gateway. Yes.
I just want to add one thing. So also, a lot of these key technologies, there's no single agency that can solve all the problems. So there's always international cooperation and agreements. And one of the ways that they do this is through barter agreements. And so like ESA, JAXA, and other space agencies, they contribute to these long-term visions and goals. And things like food production or ECLIS are some of those technologies that are contributed in exchange for other services. And so when we pool all our resources and knowledge together, then there's a much better understanding of how these technology gaps can be bridged without doubling efforts, let's just say. And I think that's a really big point that everybody should understand, is that this is an international effort, and it always will be.
You addressed some of the manufacturing things, and the gentleman from the Navy brought up appropriately that you can't afford a failure in a turbine blade. But we look at past explorations, we look at OPI, which lasted forever, it seems, on Mars, but really a fraction of the time that you would need electronics to be reliable for. And the remanufacturing of microelectronics is a whole different deal than even making the structure, given the location. What are the plans, or what's the vision for how to handle system failure when you can't get spare parts and you can't just say, oh well, it's unfortunate?
The second part of that presentation, which you all didn't get to hear, was talking about the agency's efforts in in-space manufacturing. I believe, and a number of people believe, that this is a capability you can't leave home without, literally. We talk about common use materials, making sure that what we launch from Earth can be recycled and repurposed. That's an initiative that has to come and get more focus on it, because right now we're not going to get there. You mentioned printing electronics. That's one of the capabilities of the new system that we hope to launch to space station in 2025. It's called the Fabrication Laboratory, or Fab Lab. And it does have the capability to print electronics, flexible wearable sensors for monitoring astronauts' health, gas sensors, cortisol sensors, a variety of things that it can print. Now, it may not be able to answer everything that we need to print, but one way to approach the problem is to say, this is the capability that you're going to have on orbit. How do you use it to design your system to get yourself home? It's not necessarily, oh, there's a part and I've got to go replace it and here's what I've got. You have to reverse the problem and start thinking about the capability you have to produce the functionality that you need. So we are looking at that, but I can't say we're where we need to be in terms of recycling, reuse, printed electronics, and even printing metals on space station, which we haven't even demonstrated yet. Fab Lab will do that as well. It will print metals and it will print plastics. It does a little bit of everything. It's a really great piece of equipment. But like I said, we started this project for in-space manufacturing 20 years ago. And here we are today, and we still can't print metals in a microgravity environment.
And space exploration is going to continue to be an enormous challenge, right? And all of these things are risk mitigations that we're trying to achieve. And while we might be able to not solve all the problems, you talk about make it rather than bring it. I think it's important to note that even when you're doing a Mars transit habitat, when you're taking that on a Mars mission, we're actually talking about the entire mass of that habitat, the entire mass of that is the same amount of mass you need for just the logistics and repair items that you're going to have to take with you. So you're talking about, if you have a 20 metric ton hab, you're going to need about 20 metric tons of logistics and supplies. That's a lot of stuff. So regenerative ECLIS is one of those areas to try to buy that back down, and then being able to develop things in situ, I think is one of those avenues.
I can add one thing, sorry. But in terms of design, a lot of the concepts you shared up there, I'm very familiar with the processes, but what I understand is that when you design something that you have to build in situ, you often have to design the machinery around that. Just like in construction, first you come up with a technology, then you come up with a design, and then that design pushes the limits of what you can build, and you have to rethink the technology to do the construction. And there's limitations of scale, of course, limitations of material, energy, and so like even that concept where you have to pack the loose regolith into the pockets is a really unique concept, because you're saving energy, you're saving time, but you're still making use of in situ resources in a unique way.
Timothy Thomas, I am a member of the Society. My question is about I'm wondering about the sovereignty of these, over these habitations, particularly and most importantly, who's responsible for defending it against future space raiders?
I don't think the answer is Indiana Jones, but it's an important question, right? I think the legal realm is another area that needs to grow in terms of policy. We know that as much as we would like collaboration across the board, we know that that's not always going to be the case. And protecting habitats and systems is going to be absolutely essential to keep them there as well. I think that is an area that I can't speak intelligently on because I'm not in the legal realm to really understand what implications that even imposes. But then you would have to have the presence of the individuals to protect it, or maybe some sort of
That's where
robotics.
BattleBots come in.
Yeah, there goes BattleBots and stuff, and then all of a sudden you got Skynet. It's all kind of crazy, but anyway.
We really want to have more lawyers up there?
More lawyers, yeah. Yeah, is that a good place for lawyers, is in space? I'm not sure. We haven't done the astronaut crew selection.
Depends on the quality of the life support system.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We don't have any national symbols on our drawing. I think it's because we're trying to work with internationals and we're trying to work with industrial partners. We don't want to just start putting the United States, and this is only the United States. I think we're going to have systems that we want to have. I mean, if we're going to a services-based architecture in terms of allowing industry to come in, build a commercial industrial base, right? You're going to have to allow them to bring in commercial individuals, and that might not always be just from one particular nation. So it's going to be a little bit of a paradigm shift, I think, than what we've seen in ISS. But that's a very good point.
Hi, I'm Frederica Derima, and I'm a member. Thank you very much for all your very enlightening presentations. You develop a lot of technologies in terms of new ways for materials, new, in a sense, other technologies, manufacturing processes, designs. Have you seen any of these things that can improve what we do here on Earth right now? That would be wonderful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think in the building industry, especially when we talk about construction, there's a lot of waste, and we understand that 40% of CO2 emissions comes from the built environment, from the use of energy and the use of construction and all the concrete that goes into building. But when you think about space, you have to factor in every gram of material that you're using, how energy is being used, the resources, can you recycle them, and it's helping us think differently about the building sector. And so we started deploying things like systems build projects where things get built off-site so that you can be more efficient on-site, and that really helps, for example, improve the life cycle of a building. But more importantly, I think it's around material technologies. I've seen a lot of interesting material technologies come into the building sector from space, as well as software technologies. So thinking about things like how do you manage resources in a building the same way that you manage resources in a space station. And I've seen already some of those things making their way into the market. I particularly have an interest in this and have been pursuing that research myself. So I definitely, if you're interested, I can talk to you about where this is happening and give you more specific details. Yeah.
I'll just add on to that. I think, from the areas when in general, when you talk about trying to design and build habitats in a hostile environment, with climate change and everything happening, I think there's so many tiebacks to just what we're experiencing on Earth, what we will be experiencing moving forward. And so I think that part of it is if we can learn how to reduce, reuse, recycle, make the most of what we have, and just be really efficient. Those are all the things, and to survive in a harsh environment like the lunar surface, there's many environments like that on Earth, and so we can be better at that. And I think even from a power perspective, I know personally, I'm very interested in where we're heading now with nuclear energy right now. And there's a lot of ties in space that we need that for in applications, and I think that's really important for sustainability as well. Obviously we talked about, solar technology. There's other things out there, visions of power beaming back to Earth using large solar arrays from the sun and bringing power to Earth. So I think there's a lot of technologies that we're seeing in space now that have direct tiebacks to Earth, and we need all those to continue moving forward and being more sustainable.
I will note, I mentioned that our partner for the hardware development and process development was Icon Technologies. Their primary business model is production of low-cost, dignified housing. They are using cementitious materials to print homes in Austin, Texas. They've printed them in Tabasco, Mexico, and I was there earlier this week, and I can tell you they make some beautiful energy efficient structures. I think the cost savings that they cited us were 41% savings in the utilities alone, not to mention the waste savings from just printing what you need for that particular home. So yeah, in that respects, some of the things that we're doing in space come back to Earth, but what they're doing on Earth helps us in space.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers. Before you go, if I'm not mistaken, we have some small token of thanks for you. 3 things: a framed copy of the announcement of tonight's lectures, signed by members of the General Committee on behalf of all the members of the Society, a rosette signifying your membership in the Society. We hope you'll wear it wherever you go. And a signed copy of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin, which you'll find the reasons the Society was formed, why it was named the Philosophical Society of Washington, who the founders were, including Joseph Emery and John Wesley Powell, and early reports of the meetings, except Daniel gets a copy of Volume 10. So with that, we thank you very much. So thank you for that. The next meeting will be the 2478th meeting. It will be on June 2nd, and the speaker will be Sean Carroll, Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins and fractal faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. He will be speaking about the real Einstein equation, which is not E equals mc squared. Mass, energy, and the curvature of space-time. The 2479th meeting will complete the spring lecture series on June 16th. The speakers will be Bill Merrill and Sam Brody of Texas A&M. They will be speaking about the $30 billion plus Ike project being planned to control rising tides and water surges that threaten to engulf Houston in flooding and storm damage. It's one of the largest civil engineering projects being contemplated in the United States, at least on the ground. Please check the PSW website often for up-to-date information on meetings. Before we go, let's thank the people who worked on putting this meeting together. Laurel Kane, who managed the room, Recording Secretary Cameo Lance for writing the minutes, General Committee Member Connor Nixon for reading the minutes, Corresponding Secretary Robert Taylor, who does the video, the sound, and the live stream, Ann McQueen for doing the live stream chat, Connor Nixon and Jared McQueen for running the camcorders, and Bill Mitchell, who hasn't done anything yet, but he will be editing the video. If any of you are interested in helping out, please let me know. We can use more volunteers. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting to the social hour.